Hello everyone and welcome. Two reports have been published today by Church Action on Poverty. They are 3 years in the researching, having had to field various COVID curveballs. They're very different in terms of methodology, but both published under the umbrella title of Church on the Margins, and they both focus on the Greater Manchester area. The first asks the question whether the Church is losing faith in low-income communities in Greater Manchester. The second asks what it means to be a church on the margins. I will introduce guests as we go. We have a wealth of them. There is a kind of plan, but you're all welcome to disrupt it. If you want to ask questions of each other, put your hands up, go into the chat box. I'll try and bring you in, make comments. And there's an awful lot to discuss, so forgive me if I sort of move us on a bit. We could really be here for a whole day's seminar on these fascinating questions that these reports raise. But to go to the first report, is church losing faith in low-income communities in Greater Manchester? This research looked at church closures across 5 denominations over 10 years, and one of its authors is Fiona Tweedie, who's with us. And Fiona, this is a rather unkind way to start, but in short, what's your answer? Yes or no? Is the church losing faith in low-income communities?
I think if you measure church by church buildings, then the figures do look as though more are being lost in more deprived areas. Our research showed that churches, the 5 denominations, did close more churches than you might expect in lower income, higher deprivation areas than in more affluent areas.
So losing faith and losing buildings is of course a different thing. But could I ask you to sort of break that down a little bit of just a few statistics about which denominations are losing what proportion of buildings they've lost over 10 years?
Yes. So we started off by mapping where all the churches were in Greater Manchester in 2020. And we had to go to the 5 denominations. And Manchester itself is a fairly new city. So the ecclesiastical boundaries, the diocesan boundaries, the synod boundaries, all kind of overlap across Greater Manchester. So we had 14 different areas to go to, 14 different ecclesiastical areas to go to. And we looked at those, and most denominations had a good spread across the levels of deprivation, and particularly Church of England. So about 20% of its churches were in each of the 5 bands. Other denominations, the Baptist Church, for example, they had over a third of their churches in the most deprived parts of Greater Manchester. Roman Catholic Church, again, lots of their churches in deprived areas of the city. The Methodist Church, on the other hand, was more of their churches were in affluent areas, although still a good number in deprived areas. I mean, we went back to 2010. Now, as you say, there were COVID curveballs. People couldn't get access to their offices to find yearbooks for us. So we had lots of fun trying to find out where churches used to be. Google Street View, local newspapers, Facebook groups, to find out where they had been. And then we did find that a number of denominations had closed more churches proportionally in the deprived areas, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, but they had lots of churches there in the first place. And the Baptist Church as well, they had lots of churches in deprived areas. So while they did close, the 50% of the churches that the Baptists closed in Greater Manchester in this period were in the most deprived areas. But they had most of their churches there in the first place.
Yeah, I think there were some statistics that I saw at the beginning of the report that 14% of Methodist churches were closed, 5% of Church of England. I think it was maybe
7% Roman Catholic.
And then we had Baptist.
11% Baptist. Yes.
And URC was.
URC was 8%.
Right. Okay. So I mean, not quite falling off a cliff yet, but if that trend continues for another 10 years or 20 years, then we're on the absolute precipice, aren't we? Can I just ask you about? You mentioned the reasons for churches being closed, and there are a lot, there's declining congregations, there's building disrepair, there's the cost of upkeep, there are fewer priests, but you suggest that doesn't explain the whole reason why there are more closures in deprived areas, and I wonder if you came up with a reason why there were.
I think for me personally, it's perhaps something about the canary in the coal mine that we're seeing things affecting churches in deprived areas, sometimes as a precursor or a warning to what might happen more largely across the country. I think we're seeing across the board a great reduction in resources in churches, a great reduction in people attending. And while perhaps it might seem easier to support churches in less affluent areas when you're doing fine and your church is fine and the roof's okay and there's plenty of people coming and you've got a minister, as soon as perhaps things for you in a more affluent area start getting a bit edgy perhaps and the roof's not quite and you haven't got someone to run the Sunday school and you haven't got volunteers, you then perhaps start to close down a little bit on generosity to the wider denomination. And sometimes while there's fabulous work going on in deprived areas, sometimes there aren't people to fight to save a church in the way that there are in some more affluent areas. But we are seeing that while the church building might have closed, there's still a lot of other activities going on and lots of ways in which the church is supporting.
And I guess the question which one of our contributors has alerted me to is, what is the church anyway? And might ask her to speak to that later. Just to say that Bishop John Arnold, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford, couldn't be with us today, but in the document that you've written, he spoke of pruning for growth. They had a consultation in Salford Diocese. But he also says we simply had too many churches for the Catholic population and the number of priests, many are reaching retirement and not being replaced. So, and we all know that that's part of the story. I'd like to go to Eunice Attwood, if I may. Eunice, you work for a Methodist church called Church on the Margins, so not to be confused with these reports. But 14% of Methodist churches closing in the last 10 years. I just wonder how you keep morale up in your denomination with that sort of figure.
Indeed. Thank you, Rosie. That's a great question. I think we've been aware in the Methodist Church of church buildings closing in low-income communities for many years now. And part of this national initiative of Church at the Margins is to intentionally put resources into low-income communities. And we're suggesting that we want to nurture new Christian communities. That's really deliberate, Rosie, not church buildings, but new Christian communities. And that might be a building, of course it might be, because sometimes in a low-income community, the building is absolutely crucial. And we're, to be honest with you, we're pleading with our circuits across the whole of the UK to really think about, if that building is in a low-income community, how could we not close it if it's the one that's absolutely needed, and if it will nurture that community?
There's one case study in the report, which is of Bolton, I think, where you had 4 Methodist churches in an area and you closed them, and then you had a new church which looked absolutely brilliant called the Triangle. But I suppose, one church, it could be further away for a lot of people to get to. You've got a very sort of elderly congregation demographic on the whole. So the point about a church being a physical presence is a real one, isn't it? When people actually have to travel a lot further, may not be able to get there, may not feel like their church, certainly in the way that the old one did.
Indeed, and perhaps that's why we need to think about churches not being all so centred on buildings. That model of if you must have a building and everyone must have a building. Maybe everyone doesn't have to have a building. Maybe you could meet in a community cafe. And I think a lot of new church communities might meet in a local community centre. And in doing so, actually help sustain that community centre, might meet in a cafe as a resource for the whole community. So I don't want us to get so fixated on buildings and forget about communities. I think it's really vital. And I think those communities, the church that emerges may look very different, Rosie. So maybe, we've seen walk-in churches, muddy church, a church that meets on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, that's in a cafe, anywhere. And so I think we need, in thinking about new places for people, need not to be so tied to bricks and mortar.
Thank you. Bishop David Walker, Bishop of Manchester. Also, you're the chair of the Board of Governors of Church Commissioners. And so, of course, I have to put that question to you, which you hear all the time, is that billions of assets in assets the Church Commissioners have got. So you're probably being fed up of this, but why can't the Church of England keep all its churches open when it has these assets? I mean, I suppose that underneath that is the question about how do you make the decisions about how churches are closed?
From a Church Commissioner's point of view, and we provide significant amounts of money, about 25 million, it may be a year, 2 million of which goes to Manchester Diocese, called Lowest Income Communities Funding. That's there specifically to help us maintain a Christian presence in those areas where the people have never been able to pay for their vicar, and they'll never be able to pay for their vicar and their building in the future. So we recognise that there always needs to be that external subsidy, and that's important. We're also getting, again, for the Church Commissioners, through strategic development funding, we've been able to build a project in Manchester called the Antioch Network, which has now got about 6 or 7 congregations running. We're building towards 16. There's a new congregations either on the outer former council estates or the inner city areas that are often very highly deprived. And so I think we've actually got more congregations in those areas now than we had when I came to Manchester 9.5 years ago. We have fewer buildings for some of those congregations, not to have to deal with the upkeep of a building erected in about 1850, probably jerry-built by the standards even of the day, and built to serve those dense urban inner city populations that don't exist anymore. The Lancashire Mill town I was born in, its population peaked in 1880 something, and it's been going down ever since. So the number of church buildings that were built to serve those highly dense white working class populations, the populations are not there, and the buildings don't quite need to be there in the same way as they were then.
Can I just ask how the decision to close a building is taken in the Church of England?
It's usually initiated by the parochial church council who decide that it's no longer viable. And they work with the diocese, and that produces a scheme which if there is opposition, then the Church Commissioners have an appellate role in determining whether the project has been properly thought through. And ultimately, obviously, if a whole parish is to close, then it needs to be transferred or split between neighbouring parishes. Sometimes it might be a building where the parish has more than one church building. Many parishes are of that nature. But there's huge consultation. Anybody who's got a vested interest in some way, perhaps they've got a family grave in the churchyard, they may be a member of the congregation, they may live in the local proximity, they're all involved in that decision. And when eventually a building does close, and I think we're closing fewer buildings than we're opening new congregations, we're very keen to see that an appropriate social use for that building is found. Sometimes it might be another Christian congregation, perhaps an expatriate diaspora group from an Orthodox or another tradition. Otherwise, it might be a local community facility. And so we work with the churches to see that the building remains part of the community's property and part of the community's assets into the future, even if it's no longer open for weekly worship.
Yes, I mean, I suppose the problem report identifies is that you've got more churches being closed in these deprived areas. So is it that we've got more congregations asking for the closures, or we need to perhaps go on to talk about the nature of the communities that we're talking about and where that what the implications of all that are. Philip Brooks, you're Deputy General Secretary Mission for the United Reformed Church. Like Bishop David was saying, you suggested to me that actually usually the impetus to close a building comes from the local church.
We would not close a church unless there is that local cooperation. But of course, there are lots of other ways of supporting churches as well. We have a system of church-related community workers, special category ministries, where we can put extra resource. Sometimes, though, it is about just reducing the millstone of buildings. Do
church buildings sometimes they stop you doing some of your other work? If you're going to keep a building going, it means you haven't got that stipend or salary for a minister or a community worker.
Actually, long ago, we stopped the correlation between what you pay in terms of into the central funds and what you get as ministry. So our ministry is allocated in terms of need, not in terms of what you have ability to pay. But it is true, if you've got an old Victorian building that's difficult in terms of upkeep and heating, it's hard to concentrate on areas of mission. And I'd also point to the fact that part of my mission team is that we concentrate very much on our ecumenical working. So I was minister in a very poor, deprived part of Salford, where we actually had two churches that came together to form one. That would have been one church closure, but the result of it was £1.5 million investment in one of the poorest parts of Salford in a brand new church and community building that opened last year. And that was specifically, that site was chosen because that was the best site for the community to access, and has food bank, community gardens, community cafe, all the things that, part of the church being on the margins is important.
I wonder, Fiona's put in the chat box that the URC closed a fewer proportion of the churches in deprived areas than other churches. So Fiona, did you identify different approaches among the denominations, or different structures within the denominations, which account for the different proportions of churches that were closed?
I'd have to say no. My job was looking at the maps and trying to find where the churches were, finding their postcodes, and then looking at the deprivation of the areas. And you got a sense for some things. It was interesting. There were so many Roman Catholic churches in more deprived areas, and a number were closed. And I would spend time on Google Street View, kind of virtually walking the street and then looking around to see if the church building was still there. Very spookily, there were some photographs from inside a church, and from outside, all you could see was a concrete slab of foundation that was left. So there were some hints, but I was really looking from the sort of geographical side of things, and not at the ecclesiology or how the churches themselves were organised.
I wonder, Niall Cooper, Director of Church Action on Poverty, if I can come to you for a moment, because the responses that we're getting to this report from the panel seems to be, well, yes, church is being closed, but no, this isn't, let's not see this as a bad news story. There's money being put in other ways, and, it's unrealistic sometimes to keep a building. And I just wonder whether you see, what are the good and bad stories you see within that question that your report asks?
I think there's another story which we might come on to, but I think the hard data that Fiona's uncovered is that those tough decisions about closing churches are disproportionately impacting on low-income communities. That's not to say that all of those decisions are wrong. But there must be, why is it that more of those decisions are being made in low-income communities than in more affluent areas? Even are the denominations aware that that's what's happening? So I'm not saying in most cases it's a deliberate strategy, although I think there are questions probably for the Roman Catholic Church in relation to that. But unconsciously, there are forces at play where it's churches with less resource, less money, potentially less asset. Human assets are the ones that close, and those will be the ones in low-income community areas. So by default, the result is that there are less buildings, and of course those buildings in many cases are community assets for the wider community and not just the church. So I think we do need to look at the hard data, but obviously there's another story about what's going on within those communities.
And we will come to that, but I just wonder whether anybody's got any answers to the question about why low-income communities are most likely to have their buildings closed. And I would also like to point out, because Bishop John Arnold isn't here, that he sort of has clearly said there isn't a strategy to close the churches in low-income areas. But can anybody respond to that question about why? Has it been noticed even?
I would go back to the population movement question. The reason, if you look at East Manchester, a generation or so ago, I think where there were 7 Church of England parishes, I think we've now got 1 parish in a new building. But actually, again, if you look what the population numbers were when those original 7 buildings were built, and look what the population is now, where huge swathes of slum clearance have happened, then all the high-rise went up, then they were all brought down again. The urban density there is a fraction of what it was for what those churches were built. So it'd be like leaving a church open in a field in Norfolk that was well, the village was destroyed by the Black Death in 1300 and something. If the population moves, you actually have to move where you're putting your churches. So I think what's missing in the research is an analysis of population numbers around those areas. So why is it that those areas are depopulated, whereas other areas, suburban areas, outer areas, are probably increased population? And so that's where church communities, new ones, are being built and created. We're not going to have the same number of churches where there isn't the same head of population.
Fiona says here, just reminding us that the research was talking about closures between 2010 and 2020. I've got 3 hands up that I can see, so I'm going to go to each of you just for a brief comment, please, and then I'm going to move on to the next report. So Philip Brooks, followed by Kate Gray, followed by Eddie Tula-Siewicz.
I think we've all pointed to some mitigating factors, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact this is a really helpful report that actually puts a spotlight on the churches, and we do need to reflect on why it is that perhaps some of these moves have happened, and particularly to work together across the denominations to say, well, actually, how can we cooperate and use the scarce resources that we all have to actually look at some of the areas that we could address in the issues the report raises, because there are some very valid points made, and I don't think we should get away from that fact.
I wonder about the presence of class in church structures and the place of people who are working class in all of the structures and decision-making places about ourselves and the local churches, and decision-making in relation to buildings, ministry, etc. And I definitely take what you say, Philippa, about it being more complex and it being nuanced. But I also wonder, and we couldn't say one is a correlation, but there's something about the spirit of austerity that I think is embedded in the structures of the church, that the spirit of austerity is affecting us all. Therefore, cuts are made, and where they're made in our different denominations affects us differently. But the place of power and resource and the kind of spirit of austerity and class, I think, have something to say to this about why.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Now, Eddie, you introduce yourself, please.
I'm Eddie Tula-Siewicz. I'm the head of communications for the National Churches Trust, and we sort of fund repairs to church buildings and try and keep them open in that way. And I wonder whether there's an issue here of quite a lot of inner city churches. They may not be listed, because they may be Victorian churches, and Victorian churches, some sort of inner city Victorian churches, were not listed, when the mass listing took place. So that makes it difficult to find money from heritage bodies if the building needs repair. Also, modern churches, it could be that some of these churches are in sort of suburban housing estates or inner city housing estates. Churches built in the 50s and 60s, they suffer from sort of quite a lot of structural problems. So it's worth thinking about, what is the building like, and that could be a reason for closure. I would say sort of wearing a sort of a climate change hat here. Of course, it's much better to keep an existing building going than to knock it down and build something new, because the carbon's already been embodied in that building, and you're saving on greenhouse gases, which comes with new construction. I don't think this report looks in great detail at the sort of heritage aspect of the buildings, but that could be something. And if a church isn't sort of grade 1 listed, then it doesn't have lots of people rallying around from those more middle class audiences who may well exist even in the inner city, saying, let's save this beautiful church. It may just think, well, it's just another Victorian church. I remember, I'm finishing now, I remember I was at a Historic England conference, and I won't name the diocese, but an archdeacon, there was someone from the Victorian Society, and he said, you've got so many wonderful Victorian churches in your diocese, why are you closing them? And the archdeacon got up and said, yes, I love these Victorian churches, but I don't need 50 of them. So, there's an oversupply issue as well, because if these buildings were built in the 19th century, a lot of them were built close to one another, so there just may be too many. Right,
this is a good point to bring in Jean Hurlston, who's the Borough Dean for Oldham, Church of England, and tells me she's got a beautiful Grade 2 listed building full of heritage and tradition, a great landmark for her town centre. Are you in your town centre, Jean?
I'm actually at Media City because I'm going to be doing some more work indoors. So I'm outdoors at this minute. But I just wanted to say that there are a lot of wonderful churches around from an architectural point of view, tradition point of view, which are fabulous buildings to visit. And I'm really pleased to say that the parish church that I belong to, Oldham Parish Church, is one of those churches. And our council says it is in the top 3 best places to visit in the borough. And we can't just say that the church is not about the building, because the building is actually quite an attraction. And last night I was in church for a rehearsal for something, came out and met a young woman who was in tears. And she said, "Is it okay if I come into your church?" And she said, "I could see all the lights on, it looked bright, and it just drew me." And so she came into the church and found a lot of, consolation just being in there. So I think we can't sort of diminish the effect that the actual place has on people. I think the other thing about town centre churches is that we don't necessarily have the same number of parishioners who live in the area. So for my congregation, a lot of them actually do travel quite a distance to get into the church. And those people are often growing older, and that's why a lot of town centre churches do feel the difficulty. But as churches, we need to work with our councils, with our communities, and be in the know and keep in touch, because our council is now bringing more housing into the town centre, and we as a church need to be there to minister to them. So churches need to be in touch. We need to be in contact all the time with our local communities, and we need to be there for people when they need us.
Interesting. It's something about the visibility of a building set aside for a particular purpose, isn't it? I guess it's just a mixed economy that's needed, isn't it? I mean, if you have church which is meeting on a Wednesday in the local gym, that's absolutely great. But it doesn't. The person who's walking past the local gym feeling wretched and wanting to go into a space isn't going to think that's the space for me to go and just sort of sit and be and regroup myself or whatever. I'm going to sort of move us into the second report. I'm just going to mention Eddie's report first. He's put in, our recent opinion poll showed huge support for church buildings, and this extended to all faiths. Kate Gray is Minister of the Dandelion Community in Wythenshawe, Greater Manchester. It's a URC church, I think. And this hasn't closed, but perhaps over the years has wondered whether it can sustain itself. Just tell us a little bit about your church story.
We are often spoken about as being in a deprived area, a tiny and older congregation. And I suppose that's part of the story, but not the full picture. So we meet 6 days a week as a church, including worship several occasions through the week, including Sunday mornings. And
what's your building?
The building is a 1960s, not at all Victorian extravaganza. It takes a variety of people to maintain and upkeep that. And over the 20 years that I've been there, there have been all sorts of different experiences of, I suppose, of closure looming. And the congregation members and elders would count themselves as maybe 15 people maximum on a Sunday morning if there was a revival. And about between 400 and 600 people part of the Dandelion community through the week in terms of footfall. And we include a community gym, a carers group, mental health group, community cafe, food bank, all the what I would call all the usual things and some more unusual things. So making a building work in that space, but also the way in which we've done things has gone topsy-turvy. So the kind of threat of closure looming has gone. The wider church have tried
Why?
to...
How has it gone?
I think a change in approach from the wider church in recent years, which has been fantastic.
So support from the centre?
A willingness to listen to local wisdom, knowledge and experience about perceived need in the local church. A willingness to be teachable and to change about resource allocation in the wider church. A willingness from the local church to skill up so we can speak in the language of the wider church more fully and join in more middle class conversations in the ways that other people can easily hear. And to do that with more risk taking, more transparency, more vulnerability and openness and trust from all different parties and partners. I think it's been a struggle for a long time, but it's working much better in recent years.
Thank you. Well, that brings me to Deirdre Bower-Latz. Deirdre it's 6:30 in the morning where she is, so you can clap in your chat boxes if you like. She's the principal of the Nazarene College in Disbury, and she's the researcher and author, one of the authors of this second report about what does it mean to be a church on the margins. Deirdre, before we start talking about the content of the report, it seems that you had a debate about the terminology in the first place. You know, what you're meaning by the margins, whether it's an appropriate term to use. Just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we spent months actually debating the language because it's a very top-down understanding, isn't it? The margins is something we identify others as. So the curiosity around how do people understand themselves as marginal? And there's something of that, certainly people are aware of the way they're perceived. But actually, we were conscious that when you go to a group of people to say, tell us about your experience of church because we think you're marginal, there's almost an implied insult or a diminishing or a potential power exchange that's really unhelpful. And so we had to navigate that. And we had that conversation actually in each group that we met in, just very transparently saying, look, we didn't necessarily choose this language, but it is the language that we're working with. How do you understand it? And actually that was really wonderful because it opened up all kinds of conversations about inherent dignity, pride in communities that others would slight, a sense of what does it mean to belong here? Because actually here is our home and a place of life for us and flourishing and hope. And so it was a really difficult conversation at times because it's contested language. And, we ended up asking, how do all of the different intersections of marginality work as well? So we're primarily talking at the moment about poverty as an economic reality for people, or the kind of multiple indices language, often a deficit language. But there's other ways of being marginal. I think somebody put in the chat, asylum seekers, refugee communities, people with immense capacity who are excluded from participating in society, people with different, perhaps, sexual identities being worked out in public. There's loads of ways of being marginal. And this really did just look at the one.
And your methodology was conversations.
Yeah, it was beautiful. I have to say, as important as it is that we think about the church closures, and I do think that's important, there's also this undercurrent of vibrant faith in places. And when you ask about what does it mean to be church, if the emphasis is on that bit, the stories that emerge are actually full of ordinary miracles, tiny spaces of seeds of life, yeast, salt, it sounds very biblical, what people say back to you. You know, here's the way we encounter Jesus in this space. Here's the way, I mean, I'm sounding very evangelical, aren't I? But, you know, here's the way grace appears in the frame of our community. Here's what it looks like for people to discover that they have an inherent dignity because the church treats them as having worth beyond their economic capacity to produce. You know, it's all this kind of very holy language that emerges in the space of conversation. And we started intentionally by saying, tell us your stories of smiling. You know, tell us about yourself. Like, we're not going to assume anything about you. And we don't want you to step into a space of victimhood. Tell us about the best of yourselves. And that actually unlocked, I think, people's imagination a bit about their own stories too. So it was a methodology I'd do again. Yeah.
But did you also hear stories of despair, or feelings of being forgotten, of being sort of abandoned by the larger church structures and denominations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest things we discussed was power and the experience of disempowerment. And, you know, we moved on from, if this is the best, what provokes you when you think about that? What would you wish you could do all the time? And from that space emerged, of course, being treated as less than because you don't have a vocabulary of power. I think Kate alluded to that. You know, we don't know how to speak to powers to say that we're valuable to the church. Those kinds of questions. People were provoked sometimes by what they saw as, I'm putting words in their mouths here, but like a patriarchal approach that dominates rather than allows subversion in gospel language. Community engagement was seen as less important than the numbers in a congregation on a Sunday morning. You know, so Kate's illustrated that neatly for us, right? Here's our gathered community on Sunday of 15. That's what the powers count. And here's our yeast community of 400 to 500. That's what is the church at work in the community. And so it was that kind of dynamic, and it is complex, and that emerged all the time. And I think disappointment with the church, we did hear stories of people who illustrated almost by contrast, here's how it felt to not have power. And then I was brought onto the elders team where I was given power. Here's how it felt to not be heard. Here's how I found my voice, or here's how I wish my voice could be heard. It was that. And, you know, that again, it emerged over time and through careful listening rather than assuming we knew what the answers would be. Yeah.
Neil, you commissioned this report. I just wonder what you would have to say about the relationship of the two reports that we've heard about this morning.
The reason we commissioned both reports was to get some hard data. And I think the fact that it was so hard to get the data was, in a sense, proved why it was important to do, that there is a baseline that shows, or at least raises questions about why churches in low-income areas are being disproportionately closed. So that's the kind of a negative story. It's about closure. And I think that plays into a wider, if we think about the wider context of these communities, so it's not just the church. These are communities that I think over my 25 years at Church Action on Poverty, they've been done to by many institutions that have pulled out, or the narratives around these communities is that these are places of failure, that the people in them are failed. There's lots of stigmatizing language about those communities that I'm sure we could all rehearse. And as church, we need to pay attention to not playing into those narratives, to not see these as places of failure, and that there might be a gospel priority to do something different. The Church of Scotland, which was one of the reasons we did this, Church of Scotland 15 years ago took a decision to say these kind of areas are the priority areas for the denomination. because this is the gospel priority. It was a theological imperative to spend twice as much money and to put twice as much people resource into these communities to say, actually, this is a positive choice that the institution could make.
That's something the Church of England could do, Bishop David, if you're still with us.
We are putting more resource into those poorer communities. As I said, we do that through lowest income communities funding. We're asking dioceses with the increased funding that we're now making available from the beginning of this year on over the next 9 years. We're saying to dioceses, we really do want the plans that you come up with where you're seeking funding to disproportionately steer that funding towards the lowest income communities, those communities that traditionally the Church of England has found it hardest to reach. So that's written into our plans for the next 9 years. It's something we're absolutely committed to, but that won't mean a Victorian barn of a building in every place 400 yards away from the next Victorian barn of a building, because that's not the most appropriate way to deliver Christian ministry, Christian mission, Christian presence in those places. And for all the embedded carbon that there is in a building, actually a modern building that is much simpler to heat, to keep warm. The congregation can look after it in a way they couldn't look after the old building. It's often the state of the building that is the crisis point when the congregation decide this can't be done. As our colleague from the National Churches Trust said, there is, if you're not grade 2 star or grade 1, there is no wider source of money to support the continued existence of these buildings.
I just think that sometimes there's an overestimation about what some people in these communities can do. I mean, I really want to hear what Deirdre says about the empowerment of local communities and where they're speaking from their own experience and not dumping our language and values on them. But I think it's also important to recognise that lots of communities, like in Hartlepool or areas in the northeast where I am, you're talking about people who are living in squalor. They're actually not even able to clean their own houses and to get their doors and areas fixed in some places. So the idea that then they can go outside of those environments and invest in something else, or see that as a place where they have an empowering voice about their community and their assets, I think can sometimes overestimate the capacity of those people, not because they don't have the capacity as adults and people in those communities, but because they've been persistently ignored or persistently marginalised. So there is something about, it's about communication. It's not about those people lacking anything. It's about our ability to communicate with them in a way that gives them dignity and gives them a voice. And I'm not sure that central church structures or any kind of empowered institution always takes time out to do that. I might be being really unfair here, but I do feel that something happens a little bit around where communities are ignored. And there are some fantastic projects who live in the communities in this region, but they often aren't heard. So I just wonder what that means.
Deirdre, would you like to, can you respond to that?
Yeah, just very briefly to respond to that. I mean, I think you've nailed it in some ways, that the thing that we discovered, or a lot of what we discovered, was that churches that had been persistent and active and intentional about empowering local people to discover their own voice, to speak, but there was a longevity. And so, the church closure is one thing, but the absence of church, or the removal of church structures that enable, empower, equip, support, liberate, is another thing. And you don't want to conflate them, but neither can you separate them. So what do we mean by churches moving out of communities? What does that mean about people within communities who actually have hope and prophetic imagination enough to say the kind of life that you're experiencing right now on the edge of the margins, actually, that you don't deserve that, you haven't made it happen to yourself. How do we surround you so that your agency, dignity, interconnectedness can be amplified somehow? And it's those kinds of things. So it's so complex, and it's easy in reports to make it seem like it's not, but actually the conversation demands thoughtfulness, time, and actually sustained engagement. Not like this is a moment where we're interested. It kind of takes the next 20 years to figure it out. Is that 20, 3 generations of time? I'm not sure I'm doing justice to what Carenza asked, but, I think there is something there about sticking with itness and empowering, equipping, agency, empowerment, dignity. I don't know if I'm nailing all of the right language, but things like that. But then the interdependence question that I'd want to push hard on, actually powers releasing their powers so that others can be amplified. That's a really gospel thing. And how does that happen?
I think the stickability is really important. In economically marginalised communities, my experience over the 20 plus years in Wythenshawe is that people are on short-term posts. And churches do that. Churches decide it's 3, 5, 7 max, and then, you know, apparently God calls somewhere else. It's usually south or it's middle class. And I think the ability of churches and wider church structures to support people to stick with and keep with that embedded knowledge. And also, I think what you'd said, Carenza, about communication, I would really love for denominations to be clear that God has favourites. And, you know, I think the thing about us wanting to appeal to all and be inclusive is great and important in lots of specific and detailed ways. But for the church denominations and structures to reflect that God has favourites, and it is people and places who are most marginalised. So we need to put money, power, resources where that is, wherever that is, through the process of community listening, community organising, and church and community audits.
I was going to make the comment that a lot of the new places in low-income communities that are beginning are actually in the north of England, which I found interesting. One's in Hartlepool, one's in Sheffield, one's in Birmingham. They're very much, and they're churches that have had that longevity that Deirdre talks about. I think you're really right. I think ordained ministry is often short-term, but Methodism is really began as a lay-led movement. And what we're rediscovering is the importance of the laity. And I think a lot of churches, a lot of new churches are going to be led by lay people, not necessarily people who are ordained, or a mixture of both. And only will come from us listening to people in our communities, where these communities are nurtured, co-delivered, and we co-thrive together. So what I rejoiced in the report is how whenever I go to my low-income community, it's joyful and I learn as much from them. It's a mutual thing. This idea that we're going in to do things to people, which the report absolutely rejects, is brilliant. I love that. So I really love the way Deirdre has caught that sense of listening and learning from. And this idea, it seems to me that Jesus often said, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. That this idea of friendship is at the heart of communities that are needed. That's the kind of church I want to belong to. It's the kind of church I do belong to, actually.
Amen to all that. And our Antioch network, one of our flagship projects, is precisely about cell-like Christian communities in those areas where sustaining heavy structure is just not where people are. They're much more relational churches. It's about building up Indigenous skills and leadership talent. Quite a high proportion of our ordinands actually now come from those more communities on the margins, if you want to use that. That phrase about it. And lay leadership, increasing role for lay leadership in some of those smaller communities, but with the oversight of a priest who may have several of those that they're helping to lead and to look after. So I think we're with the message. It's fantastic what local people do when they enable to take control and in that sort of way and to run their church. We do recognise, and it's always been the case, I've ministered in those churches, that if you develop the skills of people in marginalised, deprived communities, a high proportion of those people will, once they develop those skills, they will sell them in the marketplace and they'll move to a nicer area. And so we know there's always a drain out of those inner city, out of those outer estate communities towards the southerners. And I don't blame people for doing that. You know, they're getting their lives together, they're bettering themselves, but it's a challenge. You're constantly having to refresh that leadership at that local level, that lay leadership.
People talked about power, but money is a key thing here. Buildings need money to be kept open, whether they're listed or not listed. Coming out of COVID, the current government gave about £50 million via the Heritage Stimulus Fund. A lot of that went to beautiful churches in the middle of nowhere with very small communities, but the heritage was regarded as being important. So there's a conversation to be had here about what happens next. If there's a change of government, or perhaps the current government, what are they going to give the next £50 million to? Is it going to be heritage, or is it going to be a community stimulus fund? So I would urge everybody on this call to contact their MPs, talk to their local councils. Councils are becoming more and more important in terms of decision making and money. Not all councils have money, but a lot of the money is going to go to councils. So it's power, but money, and buildings need money. Try and get hold of some, or get people to give you more.
Thank you. Just a last word, I think, from Niall Cooper, who, as he says, has been Director of Church of Action on Poverty for over 25 years. Interesting, the talking about churches on the margins. So the question of the report is, what's it like, I think, being a church on the margins? Was that it? What have you learnt?
For me, having started off painting a kind of negative picture, actually what I end up with is a story of hope. That these are communities of hope. These are congregations and people of faith who have stuck with their communities, not out of kind of obligation, but because they're places that they love, and they are communities that they love, and they are part of faith communities that are their families, and that's counterintuitive, countercultural as a message. That through faith communities, the resilience of local people can come to the fore. And these are places of hope. And whenever I go to communities like this, I come away inspired, just like Deirdre does and other people have said. And that's a really positive message that I think that the church both needs to hear and then celebrate. And some denominations, most denominations are trying and are going in the right direction, but it's a story that just needs to be shared much more loudly. And when it comes to hard decisions about resources and money, absolutely, these need to be prioritised over the long term. And that might, for some denominations, mean tough decisions about resources not going elsewhere if this is the gospel priority, to ensure that the poorest and most vulnerable communities, whatever language we use, are ones that are supported to be the best communities that they can. And that's why we've commissioned this. And we're now looking to the next phase about how we really enable people in those communities and their voices to be heard, and shape the strategies and decisions of the churches as institutions, which ultimately will be how those communities get access to power and are able to ensure that they have dignity and agency in how the wider church sees the world and makes decisions about how to allocate resources, people and money. And of course, wider society as well, because this is not just a conversation about church, it's how all communities are represented in society and are able to articulate that they should get kind of justice in terms of how wider decisions about resources are made within societies, communities, and ultimately as a country.
Thank you. That was a really interesting and hopeful conversation. Thank you all so much for participating. I also really enjoyed it, and have a lovely afternoon.